Work hard and stay here. That's what the bitter cowboy told her on that first morning, his voice cold as winter stone. Jasmine May Holloway believed him. She worked until her hands bled, until the ranch began to breathe again, until even the bitter man started to soften. And then, on a morning he finally opened his heart and begged her to stay forever, she did something no one expected. She left. But to understand why, you need to know what happened in those weeks between his command and her choice. Spring had come to the valley like a quiet promise. The mountains still wore white caps in the distance, but the low land had turned soft and green. Apple blossoms scattered pale petals across the yard like bits of snow that forgot how to be cold. New grass pushed up along the creek bank, and the air smelled of damp earth, fresh sap, and smoke from wood stoves. A hand pump stood near the barn, dark iron with a worn handle, and beside it were two wooden buckets that had seen years of use. Fence posts lined the property in rough rows, rails set by hand, each one a little crooked from age and weather. Everything here had been built the slow way, by sweat, by time, by stubbornness. The ranch sat alone, far enough from town that the road felt more like a thought than a path. The dirt track cut through fields and brush, winding toward the house and barn as if it had learned to keep its head down. Beyond the fences, the land opened wide, quiet and watchful. If you listened long enough, you could hear the creak of wood in the wind, the far cry of a hawk, and the steady sound of your own breathing. It was beautiful in a way that made a person feel small, and it was lonely in a way that made a person feel known. Jasmine May Holloway reached the ranch at dawn, her boots dusted and her shoulders tight from the long walk. She was 23, though the last few years had pressed hard on her and made her look older in the eyes. Her dress was faded at the seams, patched at the elbow, and too thin for the morning chill. She carried a canvas bundle tied with twine, and the bundle looked light enough to be sad. Everything she owned was in it. She kept her chin lifted, not proud exactly, but steady. She had learned that if you walked like you belonged somewhere, people were less likely to ask why you didn't. She stopped at the wooden gate, fingers resting on the top rail. The wood was rough, splintered in places, and stained dark by rain. She looked out over the land as if she were trying to read it, like a letter. The garden plot sat off to the side, narrow and tired, rows half-choked with weeds. The house was plain and weathered, paint worn thin, porch boards gray from sun. Near the barn, a mare shifted her weight and flicked her tail, patient and bored. Jasmine took all of it in and felt something tighten in her chest. Not fear, not hope, something quieter than both. A man stood on the porch. He had not come down to meet her, and he didn't wave. He simply watched. William Dawson was 35, tall and solid, with dark hair that needed trimming and a face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. His jaw was set in a way that made his silence feel like a decision. He wore a work shirt with the sleeves rolled, a worn vest, and boots scuffed at the toe. In his hand was a tin cup, and the steam rising from it told her he'd been up for a while. His eyes found her bundle, then her hands, then her face, as if he were taking inventory. Jasmine pushed the gate open and stepped through. The hinge squealed, loud in the morning stillness. "You're early," William said. His voice carried without effort. No warmth, no welcome, just a fact. "I didn't want to waste daylight," Jasmine replied. She kept her tone respectful, careful. "Sir." He studied her for another beat. Then he nodded once, sharp, like he didn't have time to waste on talk. "Come on." She followed him up the porch steps. The boards groaned under their boots. He opened the door and held it, not out of kindness, but out of habit, like a man who lived by rules even if he claimed he didn't. Jasmine stepped inside and was met by the smell of coffee, soap, and old wood. The kitchen was clean but bare. A cast-iron stove sat cold, a kettle on top. A table stood near the window, its surface marked by years of use. There was no lace, no bright cloth, no little touches that said a woman lived here. It felt like a place that had stopped expecting comfort. William walked straight through the kitchen and down a short hall. He didn't ask if she was hungry. He didn't offer water. He moved like a man who had lived alone too long and forgot that other people needed things. He stopped at a narrow door and pushed it open. That's yours. Jasmine stepped forward and looked in. It wasn't a room so much as a storage space someone had cleared out. A small cot sat against the wall, mattress thin, blanket folded tight. A peg on the wall for hanging clothes. A single shelf. No window. The air smelled faintly of dust and old grain sacks, though the sacks were gone now. The walls were plain boards, unpainted, and the ceiling low enough to make her feel she should keep her head down. She swallowed. She'd slept in worse places. She'd slept in barns, in back rooms, in corners where she had to stay quiet and unseen. Still, something about this room told her exactly what he thought of her place in his life. William leaned against the doorframe. 2 weeks, he said. That's the arrangement. Yes, sir. Jasmine answered quickly. His eyes narrowed a touch, as if her politeness irritated him. Or maybe it reminded him of something he didn't want to remember. He pushed off the frame and walked back to the kitchen. Jasmine followed. William set his tin cup on the table and stared at her like he was about to lay down the law for a hired hand, not take on a person. You'll work the garden. Pull weeds, turn soil, plant what I've got stored. Fence needs mending on the south line. House needs cleaning. Barn floor needs sweeping. And the chickens feed him and gather eggs. Jasmine nodded with each task, holding them in her mind like she was stacking wood. Then he spoke again, and his voice hardened as if he were carving the words into stone. Work hard and stay here. 2 weeks. Nothing more. There it was. Not a request. Not an offer. A command. Jasmine's throat tightened, but she didn't let it show. She had learned, long ago, that arguing with a man who had land and power never ended well for a woman with nothing but a bundle. I understand, she said. William's gaze flicked away, just for a moment, and when it returned it looked sharper, like he was holding back something that didn't have a name. Meals are simple, he added. You eat after him. Yes, sir, Jasmine said again, because the word was safer than the truth. William turned toward the counter, opened a cupboard, and pulled out a small sack of flour. He set it down with a thud. Make bread when you can. There's beans, dried apples, salt pork. Don't waste it. Jasmine listened. She didn't ask about pay. She didn't ask about town. She didn't ask anything that might make her feel like she mattered. Her hands stayed folded in front of her, fingers tucked in so they wouldn't tremble. She kept her movements small, careful, like she was afraid that taking up space might offend him. William watched her for a long moment. He told himself she was just help. That's all he needed. Help to get the place back in order. Help to keep the ranch from sinking deeper into neglect. He'd made a decision after the last time, after the grief, after the quiet that swallowed his life whole, that no one would ever get close enough to leave him ruined again. People came, people went. That was the way of it. Let them work, pay them, send them on. But standing there in the pale morning light, watching Jasmine keep her eyes lowered like she expected to be struck for breathing wrong, he felt a small stir inside him. Not kindness, not yet. Something like discomfort, like a man finding a splinter and refusing to admit it hurts. That he pushed the feeling down. Get started, he said. Jasmine went out to the yard and crossed to the garden plot. She set her bundle near the fence and rolled up her sleeves. Her hands moved with quiet skill. She tested the soil, pulled the first thick weed at the root, shook dirt from it, and tossed it aside. She didn't waste motion. She didn't pause to sigh. She worked like work was the only language she trusted. William stood on the porch for a while, arms crossed, studying her like he expected her to fail. Most people did. They lasted a day or two, then complained, then left. Or they stayed and grew bitter. Like him, Jasmine didn't complain. She didn't even look up that a wagon rolled by on the road late in the morning, pulled by a pair of horses, wheels creaking, dust lifting in a soft cloud. A woman sat beside the driver and turned her head as they passed. Her eyes landed on Jasmine in the garden. The woman's stare was quick, sharp, and full of judgment, like she had already decided what kind of girl worked alone on a man's ranch. Jasmine felt it like heat on her skin. She kept her head down, fingers digging into the soil as if the earth could hide her. William saw the wagon. He saw the woman stare. He saw Jasmine's shoulders tighten, but he said nothing. The wagon moved on. Dust settled. The valley returned to its quiet. Jasmine kept working through the afternoon. She cleared a whole row, then another. She straightened the soil, made neat lines, and planted seeds with care, like each one was a small promise she was making to a future she couldn't fully believe in. The sun warmed her back, and the wind carried apple blossom scent across the yard. Her hands grew sore. Dirt worked under her nails. When she wiped her brow, she left a faint smear of soil on her skin as the light started to soften toward evening. William came down off the porch and walked the fence line, hammer in hand. He didn't speak to her, but he didn't go far either. He worked at a loose rail and drove the nail in with steady blows. The sound echoed across the yard. Jasmine glanced his way once, then went back to her seedlings. William looked over at her again. He didn't want to notice the way she handled the work like she respected it. He didn't want to notice that she moved as if she was used to being watched. He didn't want to notice the quiet strength in her posture, the kind that didn't ask permission. He told himself she'd be gone in 2 weeks. He told himself it didn't matter, by the time he realized he was wrong about both, it would be too late. Jasmine woke before the sky turned blue, the house still dark and quiet, and she dressed by feel so she would not make a sound. The air had the cold bite of early spring, and she could see her breath when she stepped outside with the first bucket, heading for the hand pump near the barn. She worked the handle up and down until water rattled into the pail, then carried it with steady arms, careful not to spill, careful not to seem clumsy, because clumsy earned sharp words in too many places she'd been. By the time William came out, pulling on his gloves and tightening the cinch on his saddle, she had already fed the chickens, gathered eggs warm in her palm, and started on the south fence where rails had sagged and nails had worked loose. He watched her from a corner of his eye while he saddled, his face set like stone, and when she passed behind him with a coil of rope, she stepped aside without thinking, the way she always had around men who owned things. On the porch, a tin cup of coffee sat steaming, and for a few minutes they stood in the thin sunrise with the valley opening up in pale light, sharing the same quiet without sharing words. He only spoke to give instructions, take the hammer to the far post, and don't bother with the north line today, and she answered, yes, sir, even though the word tasted like dust. Mid-morning, the sound of wheels and hose came down the road, and a supply wagon rolled in with a driver William seemed to know, the kind of man who acted like he had a right to every space he entered. He greeted William with easy talk about cattle and feed, leaning on the wagon seat like he owned the porch. Then his eyes slid to Jasmine, where she was bending over the garden rows, pulling weeds with dirt under her nails. His look lingered too long, and his smile had a sharp edge to it. Didn't know you had hired help, he said, loud enough for her to hear, and then, with a half laugh, or maybe you found yourself a more convenient arrangement out here. Jasmine felt heat crawl up her neck, but she kept her hands moving, kept her face turned toward the soil as if she hadn't heard. She waited. She didn't know what she waited for exactly. Maybe one firm word, one simple correction, one sign that she wasn't alone in this. But William only took the sack the driver offered and talked about prices like nothing had happened. No defense, no warning, no hard stare to stop the man's mouth. The driver climbed down, dust clinging to his boots, and as he passed Jasmine, he tipped his hat with the same smile, like he'd won something. Jasmine's stomach tightened, but she swallowed it down and kept working until the wagon creaked away and the road went quiet again, and the silence left behind felt heavier than the insult itself. Not long after, William handed her a short list and pointed to a small chestnut horse tied near the barn. Take the spare mare, he said. Go to town. Get flour, lamp oil, and nails. Don't dawdle. Jasmine's fingers paused on the paper, her chest tightening at the thought of town, but she only nodded and said, "Yes, sir," then climbed into the saddle with practiced care. The riding was slow and lonely, hoofbeats soft on the dirt road, wind tugging at her hair, and as the ranch disappeared behind her, she felt exposed, like she was stepping onto a stage without choosing to. Town came into view as a cluster of buildings and hitching posts, smoke rising from chimneys, voices carrying from the boardwalk, and the general stores smelled of flour dust, leather, and pickles and brine. Wooden shelves rose behind the counter, oil lamps hung overhead even in daylight, and barrels sat open with dry goods. Mrs. Crowley stood near the register, an older woman with sharp eyes behind spectacles. And the moment Jasmine stepped inside, the talking around her thinned. Mrs. Crowley looked her up and down like she was measuring cloth. "So you're the one staying at Dawson's place," she said. Not quite a question, and a few women near the stove turned their heads, whispers popping like small sparks. "Alone with a man, no family, shameful. Some girls don't mind their reputations." Jasmine's cheeks burned, and she kept her voice even as she read from the list and counted coins into her palm. She did not argue. She did not explain. She had learned that explanations only gave people more to tear apart. She took the flour, the oil, and the nails, tied them carefully, and left as quickly as she could without looking like she was running. The ride back felt longer than the ride in, as if the road itself had grown heavier. And when the ranch finally came into sight, Jasmine's hands tightened on the reins, not with relief, but with a hard, private promise. If she could not earn respect, she would at least earn distance. She unloaded supplies without being asked, went straight to work, and moved faster than before, as if speed could outrun judgment. That evening she made a simple stew and a small round of bread on the cast iron stove, the smell filling the kitchen with something almost like comfort, but she did not sit at the table. She ate standing near the back door, one eye on the dark hallway, keeping herself small as she had on the first day. Then she poured a second portion into a bowl and set it quietly outside William's door like an offering she did not have the right to hand him directly. Later, she heard his boots, heard the soft scrape as he picked it up, and then nothing. No thanks, no word, no sign that he understood what it cost her to be kind when she felt so unwanted. She washed the dishes until they shone, wiped the counter twice, swept the floor, and left the kitchen so clean it looked untouched, as if she'd never been there at all. Night fell cool and clear, crickets starting up in the grass, and Jasmine walked to the fence line for one long moment, staring at the dark hills beyond the valley, wondering if freedom lived somewhere past them, or if it was something a person had to build inside their own chest first, because right then, standing under a sky full of stars, she could feel a quiet truth taking shape. She could work hard, and she could stay, but staying was not the same as belonging, and if she ever wanted more, then survival. She might have to find the courage to step away before anyone else decided her place for her. The third morning came in gray and heavy, with clouds hanging low over the valley and a chill that seeped into Jasmine's bones before she even swung her feet off the cot. Her arms ached from hauling water and mending rails. Her fingers felt raw, and when she stood, she had to pause for a breath like her body was asking for mercy she could not afford to give. She washed her face in cold water, tied her hair back, and went straight out to the garden, where the soil was damp and darker than the day before, and the rows she'd cleared looked like thin lines of order fighting against wildness. She knelt and began weeding again, working slower than usual, not from laziness but from fatigue, and she hated herself for every moment her hands hesitated. The sky stayed dim, and the air smelled of rain that had not yet fallen. By late morning, two women from town came along the road on foot, bonnets tied under their chins, baskets looped on their arms, their steps steady until they noticed Jasmine in the garden. They did not stop, but they slowed, and they spoke loud enough to carry, as if the road belonged to them, and so did the right to pass judgment. "Some girls don't mind their reputations," one said, her voice sweet in the way poison can be sweet. The other let out a short laugh. Living alone with a man, she added, shameful, if you ask me. Jasmine's hands froze in the soil, fingers wrapped around a weed she'd pulled halfway free. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to the sound of blood in her ears and the rough feel of dirt under her nails. She did not turn. She did not look at them. She had learned that giving people your eyes could feel like giving them permission. Across the yard, William was on the porch, and she knew he heard every word because she saw his body go still, saw his grip tighten on the porch post like he might crush the wood. She waited again, one small part of her still foolish enough to hope he would step down, say something, end it, but he didn't. He stood there, silent as stone, while the women walked on, their laughter fading into the distance. Jasmine's throat tightened until it hurt, and she forced her hands to move again, tearing the weed free, then another, working as if she could bury the humiliation in the rows. By afternoon, the inside of the house felt too close, but chores waited, and when she asked in a quiet voice, "Sir, would you rather I stay outside today? I can finish the fence line first." William's head snapped up like the request offended him. "Do what you were hired for," he said, harsh and clipped. "The rest can wait." The words landed like a slap. Not because they were cruel on their own, but because they reminded her of exactly what she was in this place. Hands, not a heart. "Yes, sir," she answered, and she turned back to the sink, scrubbing the kettle, wiping the counter, sweeping the floor, moving in clean, careful patterns that kept her from shaking apart. She worked methodically, telling herself she was fine, telling herself she had been judged before and would be judged again, telling herself it didn't matter because she had survived worse than whispers. But the house held echoes, and every quiet corner seemed to press her smaller. Late in the afternoon, she gripped the edge of the kitchen table without meaning to, her knuckles white, her shoulders stiff as boards, and she breathed too fast, like she'd run a mile though she hadn't gone anywhere. When William came in, he stopped short, noticing her posture, the way her head was bowed like she was holding something down. "You done for the day?" he asked, and his voice was flat, almost ordinary, which somehow made it harder. Jasmine did not answer right away. The room felt too still. Her throat burned, and she swallowed, and then the sound that came out of her was a sharp, broken sob that surprised even her. Tears spilled before she could stop them, hot and humiliating, and she pressed the heel of her hand to her mouth as if she could force the emotion back inside. William took a step, then halted, like he didn't know what to do with a crying woman in his kitchen. Jasmine shook her head, staring at the tabletop as if it could keep her steady. "I know I'm just here to work," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "I know I'm nothing more than that." She breathed in, trying to stop the tears, but they kept coming, and anger rose beneath them. Not loud, not wild, just tired and true. "I try not to be trouble," she went on. "I don't ask for more. I don't take up space. I eat after you. I keep quiet. I clean until there's no sign of me." Her fingers tightened on the table edge. "But I get tired," she whispered, and that word held more weight than any shout. "I get tired of being looked at like I'm doing something wrong just by standing still. Like my very presence is something to be ashamed of." William's face changed, not soft exactly, but stunned, as if the words had reached a place in him he kept locked. He pulled out the chair at the table with a rough scrape. "Sit," he said, and it was the first time his voice sounded like an instruction meant to help instead of control. Jasmine hesitated, then sat because her legs were trembling, and she wiped at her cheeks with the back of her hand, ashamed of the tears, ashamed of the need. William stood across from her, hands at his sides, looking at her like he had finally seen the cost of his silence. "I didn't mean to make you feel small," he said, and the admission sounded strange in his mouth, like words he didn't use often. Jasmine let out a bitter little laugh that held no humor. "It's all right," she said, voice cracking. "I'm used to it." The moment the words left her, she wished she could pull them back, because they made her sound like she had accepted something she should never accept. William flinched as if she'd struck him, and for a beat, the kitchen felt full of something old and aching that neither of them named. Jasmine stood, steadier now, not because she was calm, but because she could feel herself closing again the way a fist closes around something fragile. "I'll finish my work," she said, and she walked past him without looking back, leaving him standing in the middle of the kitchen with the sound of her sob still hanging in the air. And that night, when the lamp was turned low and the house settled into darkness, William sat alone at that same table, staring at the wood grain as if it held answers, and he remembered another set of tears years ago. Another moment when his silence had done damage he could never undo, and for the first time since. Jasmine arrived. Fear moved through him like a cold wind. Fear that he was repeating himself. Fear that he would lose what little light had entered his life. And fear that this time, when the chance came to speak, he might still choose the easy cruelty of quiet. William barely slept, and when he did, it was the kind of sleep that left a man more tired than before, because his mind kept returning to Jasmine's words at the kitchen table, to the way she'd said, "I'm used to it," like it was a coat she'd worn so long it no longer felt heavy. Before dawn he gave up on rest, pulled on his boots, and stepped into the cold morning with the sky still dark and the stars faint over the ridge. He walked to the hand pump and worked the handle until water ran clean, then filled a bucket and carried it to the porch as quietly as he could, setting it where she'd see it first thing. He gathered the tools she used most, a hammer, nails, a coil of wire, and placed them near the fence line by the south post so she wouldn't waste time hunting for them. Then he went back inside and set out bread and a jar of preserves on the porch table, like he was leaving a peace offering for a person he didn't know how to speak to. When he heard the soft creak of her door, he stepped back toward the hallway, not wanting to make the moment awkward, not wanting to see suspicion in her eyes and lose his nerve. Jasmine came out into the thin gray light, her hair pinned back, her face still puffy around the eyes, though she held herself stiff and controlled. She stopped when she saw the bucket of water and the bread, her gaze moving from the items to the pump, then to the curtain where she caught the smallest movement, the hint that he was watching. Her mouth tightened, and she didn't say thank you. She didn't smile. She only poured water into the wash basin and washed her hands slowly, as if she didn't trust gifts that came after harm. She ate a small piece of bread with careful bites, then went straight to work, shoulders squared like she was building armor one nail at a time. William watched from the porch with a strange tightness in his chest, and he told himself he deserved her caution, because kindness after silence didn't erase the silence. It only proved you'd had the chance to be better and chose not to. By mid-morning, the sound of hooves came up the road, and two men rode in on horseback, dust clinging to their pant legs and hats tipped back with easy confidence. They greeted William with talk about grazing land and cattle prices, and while they spoke, their eyes drifted to Jasmine in the garden, where she was bending over the rows, her dress worn but clean, her hands moving with steady skill. One of them smiled in a way that made Jasmine's skin crawl, and he said, "Nice help you got there, Dawson," like her work was a joke and her presence was entertainment. The other chuckled. "Convenient arrangement," he added, and the words landed in the yard like something rotten. Jasmine's hands stilled for a second, and she felt that old heat crawl up her neck again, the old instinct to shrink, to disappear. She waited for the familiar nothing, but this time William's voice cut across the space sharp enough to make both men blink. "She works here," William said, and his tone had steel in it. "That's all. And she works harder than both of you combined." The riders exchanged looks, surprised at being checked, and one lifted his hands like he meant no harm. "Just making conversation," he muttered. William didn't soften. "Then make it elsewhere," he said, stepping forward so his body blocked the porch like a warning. The men shifted in their saddles, suddenly less comfortable, and after a few stiff words about the road and the weather, they turned their horses and left, their pride bruised and their laughter gone. Jasmine had heard everything, every word, every firm line he drew, and her chest tightened in a way that almost hurt because part of her wanted to feel grateful and part of her wanted to ask why it had taken so long. She kept her head down and returned to the soil, but something inside her shifted, like a gate that had been stuck finally moved an inch. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was proof that silence was a choice, and so was speaking. That afternoon, Jasmine went back to her little room to fetch twine and found the loose latch on her door repaired, set properly so it closed with a clean click instead of a wobble. On the cot was a thicker wool blanket folded neat, and beside it sat a small wooden stool that hadn't been there before, simple and sturdy, the kind a person could sit on without feeling like they were borrowing space. She stood very still, her fingertips brushing the edge of the blanket. An emotion rose so fast she pressed her lips together to hold it back. Hope was dangerous. Hope had tricked her before. Still, the small changes felt like someone admitting she belonged to more than a storage corner. She didn't call out a thanks. She didn't go looking for William. She simply folded her spare shirt on the stool and went back to work, keeping her face steady while her heart tried, against her will, to open. Toward dusk, the light turned golden and soft, and William came to the garden without being asked, carrying a sack of feed he set near the fence. He didn't announce himself, he didn't crowd her, he only took up work of his own, repairing a rail a few yards away while she tended the seedlings she'd planted, patting soil around tender green tips that had begun to push through. They worked side by side in silence, not the punishing kind from before, but a quieter silence that didn't feel like dismissal, a silence with room in it. At one point, she handed him a nail without looking up, and his fingers brushed hers for the briefest second, and both of them went still like the touch had meaning neither could name. When the last light slipped behind the ridge, William straightened and wiped his hands on his pants. He looked at the neat rows, at the stubborn green sprouting in the soil, then at Jasmine, who stood with dirt on her palms and exhaustion in her posture. "You did good work," he said, plain and honest, as if praise were a tool he was learning to use. Jasmine nodded, unable to trust her voice, and she turned toward the house. He followed a few steps behind, not close enough to crowd her, not far enough to feel like he was retreating. They entered the kitchen in separate paths, and though they did not sit together that night, the space between them felt smaller than it had the day before. Later, in the dark, Jasmine lay on her cot staring at the wooden ceiling, listening to the house settle. And she knew William's kindness now was real. She could feel the effort in it, but it didn't erase the earlier days, the judgment she'd swallowed alone, the way she'd learned to make herself invisible to survive. Somewhere deep inside, a seed took root, not in the garden she was coaxing to life, but in her own heart. The seed of leaving, not out of spite, not out of anger, but out of a quiet need to prove that if she ever stayed anywhere, it would be because she chose it freely, not because she had nowhere else to go. The days that followed did not change all at once, but they changed the way dawn changes the valley, slowly, quietly, and then suddenly you realize the light has returned. William began rising earlier, not to avoid Jasmine, but to meet the day the same way she did. And instead of barking orders from the porch, he started asking simple questions like, "What do you need first?" Or, "Which fence line will we tackle?" And the questions sounded awkward in his mouth, like a man learning a language he had refused to speak for years. Jasmine remained careful, still guarded, but she could not ignore the pattern of his effort. He took the heavy bucket without being asked, split kindling, and left it stacked by the stove, and when she cooked, he sat at the table and waited, not with impatience, but with the kind of quiet respect that told her she didn't have to hide in the corners anymore. One evening, after a long day of mending rails and turning soil, they ate stew in the lamplight, the oil lamp casting warm circles on the table, and for the first time, the silence between them did not feel like punishment. William spoke about the weather and the creek level, about how the north pasture would be good by early summer, and Jasmine answered with short, steady replies that grew a little longer when she realized he was listening. It started small, talk of horses and feed, of which rows in the garden needed more water. But then it drifted carefully to things that mattered. William stared at his cup for a long time before he spoke the truth he'd kept buried. "My wife died 5 years ago," he said at last, voice low, like he feared the words would break something. "Childbirth." His jaw tightened, and the lamplight caught the hard line of grief he wore like armor. The baby didn't make it either. Jasmine's spoon paused halfway to her mouth, and she felt the room shift like a door had opened onto a colder space. William swallowed, eyes fixed on the table as if he could hold himself together by holding his gaze down. "After that, I didn't know what to do with my days," he continued. "So I worked, and when the work didn't fix the hurt, I got mean. I stopped letting anyone in. Thought it was safer that way." He let out a breath that sounded rough. "Turns out it just made me hollow." Jasmine did not rush to comfort him, because she knew grief did not like to be hurried, and pity could feel like pressure, so she only said, softly, "I'm sorry," and meant it in a way that respected the size of his loss. After a moment, she offered a piece of her own truth, not as payment for his confession, but because the air between them had finally become honest enough to hold it. "I don't have family," she said, fingers tightening around her cup. "My parents died when I was younger. I've worked wherever I could, kitchens, laundry, mending, anything that kept me fed." She gave a small, tired shrug. This job wasn't a dream. It was survival. William looked up then, and for the first time his eyes held something other than bitterness. They held understanding, the kind that doesn't try to fix you, only sees you clearly. After that night, closeness grew in small, steady ways. His hand brushed hers when she passed him a tool, and neither of them pulled away too fast. He carried the sacks of feed and left her the lighter chores without making it seem like she couldn't handle the work. She began humming while she kneaded dough, a soft tune she didn't seem to notice she was making, and William would pause in the doorway as if the sound was something rare he didn't want to startle. One afternoon, a bird swooped down and snatched a clothespin from the line, hopping away with it like it had won a prize, and Jasmine laughed. An actual laugh, surprised and bright. And William froze mid-step, struck by the sound, as if it was a bell ringing in a place that had been quiet too long. He watched her cover her mouth, embarrassed by her own joy, and in that moment he realized how little happiness she'd allowed herself, and how much he wanted to be part of the life that could bring it out. Again, as the end of the second week drew near, William grew restless in a way he couldn't hide. He found reasons to work near her, to walk the fence line at dusk beside her without crowding her, to talk longer when the lamp was lit, and Jasmine noticed the change but didn't name it because naming things gave them power, and power could be dangerous. On Sunday, William saddled both horses and told her they were going to church in town, and Jasmine's first instinct was fear. The store whispers still clung to her skin, but William said, firm and calm, "You shouldn't have to hide." They rode in side by side. The church a small wooden building with a simple steeple, and inside, Jasmine felt eyes turn toward her like wind shifting through grass. She kept her posture straight and her face calm, but her stomach tightened when Mrs. Crowley's voice carried after the service, loud enough for a circle of women to hear. "Some women have no shame," Mrs. Crowley said, her tone sharpened for an audience. "Living in sin and pretending it's work." Jasmine's breath caught, and she braced for the familiar loneliness. But William stepped forward before the silence could swallow her. "Mrs. Crowley," he said, his voice clear and steady, "Jasmine works at my ranch honorably." He looked around, not angry exactly, but unmovable. She's shown more grace and dignity than anyone here has offered her. His gaze returned to Mrs. Crowley, and a line in his tone left no room for argument. "If you have a problem with that, take it up with me." The crowd went quiet, the kind of quiet that means someone has been put in their place without shouting, and Jasmine stood stunned, heat rising behind her eyes not from humiliation this time, but from something dangerously close to relief. On the ride back, the wind cool against their faces, she finally found her voice. You didn't have to do that, she said, because gratitude felt too vulnerable to speak plainly. William kept his eyes on the road. Yes, I did, he answered, and after a beat he added, softer, should have done it sooner. When the ranch came back into view, Jasmine saw the garden rows straight and green, the fences standing taller, the house looking less like a place that had given up, and she realized the ranch had changed because she had poured herself into it. But William had changed too, and that was harder to ignore. Yet the calendar did not care about feelings. 2 weeks was 2 weeks, and the end of their agreement stood like a fence post ahead. That night, William went out to the barn alone, the smell of hay and leather surrounding him, and he whispered words into the dark as if practicing a prayer. Words he felt foolish for needing, words he never thought he'd say again. Because tomorrow marked 2 weeks exactly, and Jasmine was supposed to leave, and William knew with a heavy, terrible certainty that if he let her walk away, he would regret it for the rest of his life. And he had one chance to stop her, one moment to speak before. Silence stole everything again. Jasmine woke before dawn on the 14th morning with a calm that felt strange in her chest, like the quiet after a storm when you're not sure if it's truly over. And she lay still for a moment, staring at the dark boards above her, listening to the house settle, letting herself feel the weight of what this day meant. 2 weeks were complete. The agreement was finished. And whatever had grown between her and William could not change the fact that she had learned to survive by leaving before. She could be pushed out. She sat up, folded her blanket, and packed her canvas bundle with careful hands, rolling her spare things tight, tying the twine in a clean knot, because order was something she could control when the rest of life could not. Everything she owned fit in that one bag, and the truth of it landed hard, not as shame, but as a reminder that she had carried herself this far on her own strength. She dressed in her faded dress, smoothed it down, and stepped outside into a spring morning so beautiful it almost felt cruel. The valley was brightening, the grass jeweled with dew, apple blossoms drifting in the light breeze, and the mountains beyond looked calm and distant, as if nothing painful had ever happened beneath them. Jasmine walked to the fence and rested her hand on the weathered rail, closing her eyes for a breath, as if she could store the smell of earth and blooms inside her for later. She looked toward the garden rows she had planted, now strong with green growth, neat and living proof that she had been here, proof that her work mattered, proof that she could make something better even when she was treated like she didn't belong. Inside the house, William sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold, his hands wrapped around it without drinking, because he'd heard the quiet sounds of packing through the thin walls, and each sound had landed in him like a hammer strike. He had practiced words in the barn, had tried to shape them into something worthy, but now that the moment was here, the words felt too small and his chest felt too tight. He stood, paced once, then forced himself to stop, because pacing wouldn't keep her from leaving. He stepped onto the porch and saw her at the fence with her bundle, morning light catching in her hair, and the sight turned his fear into urgency so sharp it almost made him dizzy. He came down the steps, boots thudding on the boards, then soft on the dirt, and as he crossed the yard he realized his hands were shaking, not from cold, but from the thought that he might be too late. "You're leaving," he said when he reached a respectful distance, a statement that carried more feeling than he wanted it to. Jasmine turned slowly, bundle in her hand, and her face was composed, but her eyes were wet as if she'd been holding emotion behind a dam. "The 2 weeks are up," she replied, steady, as if she were repeating the only rule that had kept her safe. "You said—" "Forget what I said," William cut in, and the sharpness wasn't anger at her, but anger at himself, at the man he'd been when he first spoke that command. He took a small step closer, then stopped, like he was afraid of crowding her, afraid she'd flinch and he'd deserve it. "I was wrong," he said, voice rough. "About everything." Jasmine's fingers tightened on the bundle, but she didn't move away. William swallowed, forcing the truth out even though it scraped his pride. "I was bitter and cruel. I made you feel invisible. When you cried in that kitchen, I saw what I become, and I hated it. His eyes searched her face. You changed this place, he continued, and his voice softened, the way a man sounds when he's speaking from the bottom of his heart. The garden, the house. He shook his head once, like he couldn't believe he was admitting it. You changed me, Jasmine. The morning seemed to hold its breath. Jasmine's lips parted as if she might speak, but no sound came. William reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a simple gold ring, worn thin with time, and he held it in his palm like something precious he had no right to offer. This was my mother's, he said quietly. She was a good woman, patient, kind, everything I forgot how to be. His eyes flicked down to the ring, then back up. She want you to have it. He lifted his hand toward Jasmine, the ring catching a soft glint of sunrise. Stay, he said, and the single word carried a plea he could no longer hide. Not as hired help, as my wife, as my equal, as my partner. His voice broke on the next line, and he didn't bother trying to cover it. As the woman I should have cherished from the first moment I saw you. Jasmine stared at the ring, and tears rose fully now, slipping down her cheeks without permission. And for a heartbeat, William felt hope's surge so strong it almost hurt. She stepped forward and reached up, and her fingertips brushed his face with a tenderness so gentle it made his throat tighten, and he leaned into her touch as if he'd been starving for kindness. In that second, he believed the world had finally turned in his favor. Then Jasmine lowered her hand, looked him straight in the eyes, and whispered a word that stopped his breath. No, the sound was soft, but it fell between them like a canyon opening. William's face drained of color, confusion and pain twisting together as if his mind couldn't grasp what his ears had heard. What? He asked, voice hoarse. What? Jasmine's hand dropped to her side, and the tears kept coming, not because she was uncertain, but because the choice cost her too. The ring gleamed in William's open palm, suddenly too bright, and the morning air felt colder than it had minutes before, because the most shocking thing Jasmine had ever done wasn't leaving the ranch. It was refusing the one thing she had wanted for so long, to be chosen. And yet she stood there, trembling but firm, as if she were holding her ground for the first time in her life, while William stared at her like a man watching the last light of his world flicker, not understanding that her no was not rejection of love, but the beginning of a truth she could no longer bury. William stood frozen with the ring in his palm, his mouth opening and closing like the words in his head had lost their way. And when he finally found his voice, it came out thin and pained. I don't understand, he said. I thought we... Jasmine drew a shaky breath, wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand, and lifted her chin with a kind of quiet courage that looked new on her, like a dress she'd sewn herself and decided to wear. I love you too, she said, and the confession made William flinch with hope that rose too fast, but she held up her hand, gentle and firm. That's not the question. She looked past him for a second, toward the garden rows, toward the fence line, toward the valley that had been both refuge and trap. And when she spoke again, her voice steadied, as if she were telling the truth to herself as much as to him. I need to know I can leave, she said. For 2 weeks, I worked to earn my place here. I made myself small. I ate after you. I hid. I tried so hard not to be trouble that I nearly disappeared. William swallowed, pain tightening his jaw, but he didn't interrupt. Jasmine's eyes glistened as she continued. And when those women hurt me with their words, you said nothing, she said. When that driver looked at me wrong, you stayed silent. I became invisible because you allowed it. William's shoulders dipped like a man taking a blow he knows he earned, and he started to speak. But she shook her head and kept going, stronger now, because once a person starts telling the truth, it gets harder to stop. You're different now, she said. I see that. I believe you've changed. But I need to know I'm choosing this life, not just surviving it. I need to leave. Not forever, but for now. The words trembled at the edges, but the center of them was solid. I need to prove to myself that I have the strength to walk away, she said. And she pressed her hand to her chest, as if she could feel that strength forming there. Because love isn't just about staying when someone asks. It's about having the freedom to leave and choosing to come back. William's eyes shone, and his voice came out quiet. How long? Jasmine let out a breath. I don't know, she admitted. However long it takes. For what? He asked, barely above a whisper. Jasmine met his gaze, and there was no anger in her expression, only a kind of clear sadness that still held hope. To know I'm whole without you, she said, so I can be whole with you. For a long moment, they stood with the morning wind moving the blossoms, the ring still in William's hand, and then Jasmine bent, lifted her bundle, and took a step back. William didn't reach for her, didn't grab her arm, didn't speak another command, because for the first time he understood what love demanded from him. Not possession, but respect. Where will you go? He asked, voice tight. Mrs. Henderson in town needs a seamstress, Jasmine said. I can mend, I can stitch. I'll work there. William nodded once, swallowing hard. If you need anything, I'll be fine, she said softly, and the line that followed carried the whole story of her life. I've always been fine. She walked to the gate, opened it, and paused with her hand on the wood. When she turned back, her eyes were wet again. Thank you, she said, for finally seeing me. Jasmine, William started, but she gave him a small, sad smile. Keep the garden watered, she said, and her voice warmed just a little. It needs tending. Then she stepped through the gate and walked down the road alone, her figure growing smaller against the wide land. And William stayed on the porch watching until she disappeared beyond the bend. And even after she was gone, he didn't move, because he was learning that waiting could be an act of love, not weakness. Time passed in the quiet way it does on open land. Days turned into weeks, and Jasmine worked in town, mending hems and stitching seams, renting a small room above the general store, earning her own coins and her own respect, making friends who spoke to her without whispers. And with each day, her shoulders loosened and her eyes grew steadier, because she was proving to herself that she could stand alone. Meanwhile, William tended the garden like it was a promise, watering each row at dawn, keeping her room clean, showing up at church with a calmer face, helping neighbors without expecting praise, changing not to win her back, but because he finally understood the kind of man he wanted to be. He wrote letters he didn't always send, but he sent one that mattered, and when Jasmine received it, the words were simple. The garden's thriving, and so am I, waiting whenever you're ready. 6 weeks after she left, William sat on the porch with coffee as the morning light spread across the valley, and he saw a figure walking up the road, and his heart stopped because he knew her stride. Jasmine reached the gate, carrying a small bag, standing taller than before, her face lighter, her eyes clear. She opened the gate and walked up the path like she belonged there by choice. She stopped at the porch steps. Hello, William, she said. William's voice caught. Jasmine. She glanced toward the garden and smiled. The garden looks beautiful. I watered it every day, he said. A pause settled, full of everything they'd lived through. Jasmine drew a breath. I'm ready now, she said. Ready for what? William asked, though he already knew. To stay, Jasmine answered. If you still want me. William set his cup down like his hands could no longer hold anything but this moment, stepped off the porch, and pulled the ring from his pocket where he'd carried it every day. This time he knelt properly in the dirt, not as a man claiming, but as a man asking. Will you marry me? He said. As my equal, my partner. As the woman I'll spend every day choosing. Jasmine's smile trembled through tears, and when she spoke, her voice was soft but certain. Yes. And if you're listening to this now, remember what Jasmine taught us. Love isn't a cage, and it isn't a debt you pay with your life. Sometimes love is having the courage to leave until you're ready to choose it freely. Because the bitter cowboy said, work hard and stay here, like it was a command, but Jasmine showed him that staying must always be a choice. And when she came back, it wasn't as a worker earning her place, it was as an equal. And that is the love worth having, the love worth waiting for.